we would be hard-pressed to look at our own world and not see bad things happening. And we as Christians, we have to have a category for bad things happening within the plan of God. Because over and over again, the Bible reiterates this point. Right? Job certainly understood this. We looked at verse 21, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Right? At least in the beginning, Job recognizes that what is happening within the sovereign plan of God. Unless we think that Job is speaking incorrectly here, the next verse, verse 22, says that in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Right? Now, if anything would be considered a sin, I think it would be accusing God of something he didn't do. Right? And this is where we need to be very humble when it comes to these kinds of passages. Right? We need to submit to the Bible on matters like this. Otherwise, we end up thinking that the existence of evil is somehow a disqualifier on God. I remember a few years ago when I was in college, there were many classes that I sat through and watched as professors and students dealt casually with God. That's why in the beginning I mentioned we need to have a bigger concept of God. I'm not trying to reduce God to a concept, but there is a sense in which when we talk about God, we need to have a big concept of God, right? I've met quite a few self-proclaimed atheists, both in college and since then. And the number one reason they always give as to why they're an atheist is because they can't reconcile a world in which God exists along with bad or evil things. Historically, this argument has been called the problem of evil. That's a philosophical name. If you want to talk with me about the deeper theological or apologetic points of that, we can maybe talk after the sermon. But many people have come to a breaking point where they ask some form of the question, well, why does God let this horrible thing happen? Right? We've just gone through major hurricanes. You know, this area is prone to flooding and things like that. And people all the time ask, where is God? Why does that happen? I do think there's a way to ask that question in a non-sinful way. But we need to be careful about where we get the answer to that question. Because over and over again, the Bible doesn't mince its words on this issue. Right? There are multiple examples throughout the Bible of bad things happening directly as part of God's sovereign plan. I've seen many arguments brought against the existence of a small God, right? But I haven't seen very many convincing arguments against the existence of a big God. That's why we need a bigger view of God. One of my absolute favorite quotes about this comes from John Piper. He said it this way: God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, and you might be aware of 3 of them. I love that quote. It's the background on my phone. Right? If the book of Job is a tough book for you to read, right, maybe go back and read the story of Joseph from the end of Genesis chapter 1. Joseph is probably my favorite story from the book of Genesis. The whole point of that story is that so many bad things happen to Job, right? And we need to be careful. They are bad things that happen to Joseph. But we see that all of those things end up ultimately serving to provide for God's people. Right? One of the greatest benefits to us reading the Old Testament is that we get most of the full story. Right? When we read stories of people like David, Joseph, Job, all these people, we see start to finish. Right? We see part of the big picture that God sees. Right? We don't just get that right away in our lives, though. We get very small pictures sometimes. But we need to trust that God sees the big picture, which means we can trust the little pictures we get. Our next point is that having a bigger view of God means not putting our own expectations on God's behavior. Let's look back in chapter 38, because we glossed over an interesting note in verse 1. Back in verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. We're going to stop right there. If you're an underliner or a note taker, that's a word you should definitely make note of. Whirlwind. Right? At this point in the story, Job and his friends have spoken for nearly 34 chapters. Right? Most of the book of Job is a dialogue between Job and his friends. Now, our familiarity with this story might lessen the significance of it, so we need to unpack some earlier parts of the story for it to land like it needs to. Right? Back in chapters 1 through 3, Job was afflicted by Satan by the permission of God. But remember, Job isn't aware of this. Right? He has no idea what's going on behind the scenes. And up until chapter 38, I think Job and his friends are a little like us. Job doesn't necessarily expect to hear audibly from God. Right? He is living his life according to God's commands. He has his routines, right? He's probably familiar with some of the examples of God speaking audibly to people, right? But I'm not sure he expected God to speak to him. And when calamity strikes Job, Job is distraught and confused, and his friends are trying very poorly to comfort him. Right? If you read those 30-something chapters, you'll see that there's a lot of bad theology mixed in there. So when we read in chapter 38 that God spoke out of the whirlwind, right? We need to pause and acknowledge just how big of a deal this is, right? Job has lost everything, right? He's in sorrow. His friends are of little comfort. And suddenly, God shows up, right? God shows up. He's right there. He's talking to them. I don't know what it must have looked like for God to speak out of the whirlwind, but whether that's literally true or it's some sort of colloquial way to reference what they can't process, that's a big deal, right? Remember, Job was a righteous man, so he knew God. He knew who God was, right? And when God shows up, notice that he doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't show up and say, "Here I am, I'm God." He just starts talking, right? Think about all the social interactions that we have with each other, right? Assuming that we didn't forget to introduce ourselves or you're dealing with a crazy person, usually there's two reasons people don't introduce themselves, right? The first reason is that you're familiar with them, right? Like when my dad wants to tell me something, he doesn't start by saying, "Hey, it's me, your dad. I want to tell you something." Right? Like, I know it's my dad. There's very few people that I can look in the eye without looking down. Right? Like, he's there. I'm familiar with him. The other reason people don't introduce themselves is when they expect that their reputation precedes them. Right? For instance, if the president walked in the room right now, I don't think he would need to introduce himself, because all of us know who he is. We know his name. I don't have to say it, right? Whether he's famous or infamous, right? He is preceded by his reputation. That's how God shows up. No introduction. He's just there. He likes to do that, doesn't he? Right? Think of all the examples of this throughout the Bible. Think of the burning bush, or the fiery furnace, or the time Jesus just showed up to the apostles after he'd been resurrected. Right? God likes showing up places. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's almost always a big event. Right? It's surprising, shocking, terrifying, for any number of reasons. And it's usually in a way that we don't expect him to show. And that gets back to our point. Having a bigger view of God means not putting our expectations on his behavior. Right? He's going to do things that don't make sense to us. That doesn't mean he's illogical or unknowable, but he's going to surprise us with things. Right? When we talk about our expectations from God, we usually do it in one of two ways. Right? We'll either question his timing or we'll question his methods. Right? Think back to the life of Jesus. His entire life could be summarized as subverting expectations. Right? There were dozens of very specific prophecies about who Jesus would be. Right? And even still, it surprised the people when he showed up. They expected the birth of a warrior king, and instead they got a humble manger birth. They expected an insurrectionist who would lead them to overthrow the Romans. Instead, they got a guy who rode into town on a donkey and surrendered himself when he was arrested. They expected some sort of final supernatural escape plan, but instead they mocked and hid as he was crucified as a criminal. God regularly does things in a way that we don't expect. And that's the story of pretty much every Old Testament patriarch. Think back to Abraham. God picked him and said, I'm going to make you great. Right? He just showed up to Abraham. Isaac, Abraham's son, was the natural-born son of a barren mother and an elderly father. Right? That's not normal. Jacob was the second-born brat who cheated his older brother out of his birthright. Right? Joseph, who I already talked about, was the second youngest child of Jacob, who had an incredible life. I would encourage you to go read the end of Genesis and see all of what Joseph went through. Moses, a Hebrew boy, was raised as a prince in the palace of the Pharaoh and ended up running away because he killed an Egyptian slaver. Right? David was the youngest son of a farmer who used a sling to kill a giant, and he became the second king of Israel and carried the Israelite line of kings. I'm a 23-year-old history teacher. Right? God likes using very strange people to do strange things. And that's part of having a bigger view of God. Right? We need to stop expecting God to act in a way that's going to make a whole lot of sense to us. Right? Both because we don't see the big picture, so we don't know what he's working towards, and because he's going to do that in a way that's not going to make sense to us.